The bank lobby in Ashwick, North Carolina, felt way too small for how loud my stepfather, Garrick Vale, was being. I stood there in my crisp military uniform, trying to keep my back straight, but my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. 22 years old and a proud military reservist, yet I felt like a child again. Garrick suddenly reached out and snatched my phone right out of my hand. The plastic clicked against his wedding ring as he turned to the bank teller with a smug, oily grin. "Transfer her military housing allowance into my account. Like always," he barked, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. I felt the heat rush to my face as people in line began to turn and stare at us. I tried to reach for my phone, but he stepped back, looming over me. My hands were shaking at my sides. I had worked so hard for that money, pushing through every mile of basic training and every long weekend of reserve duty. It was supposed to be my ticket to a real future, but Garrick saw it as his personal piggy bank. The teller looked between us, her eyes wide with clear discomfort as the tension in the room thickened. Garrick didn't care that people were watching. In fact, he seemed to thrive on the attention. When I whispered that we should talk about this at home, he laughed, a cold, sharp sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. "You're being selfish and ungrateful, Zarel," he shouted, making sure every person in the lobby heard him. He told the teller and the strangers in line that I was refusing to pay rent to the man who had raised me, the man who had supposedly saved me. I felt humiliated standing there in the uniform I had earned, while he treated me like a criminal. He wasn't done, though. He leaned over the counter and said something that felt like a physical slap. Without me, she'd still be trailer trash. The room went dead silent. The teller froze, her hand hovering over the keyboard, looking horrified by his words. I felt smaller than I ever had in my life, exposed and shamed in front of my own community. As I looked down at the floor, trying to hide the tears stinging my eyes, I noticed a woman near the back of the bank. She wasn't looking away like the others. She was holding her phone up, quietly recording the entire scene. I didn't sleep at all that night, and by the time the sun came up, my world had shifted. I woke up to my phone buzzing nonstop on the nightstand. When I finally checked it, I had dozens of messages from friends and people in local military spouse groups. The video of the bank confrontation was circulating everywhere online. People were asking if I was okay and if I needed a place to stay. My stomach churned as I realized our private family mess was now public news. Downstairs, I heard a crash and then Garrick's voice booming. He had discovered the video, too. He was exploding with rage, accusing me of trying to ruin his reputation and humiliate him publicly. My mother, Celine, came into my room with her eyes red from crying. She didn't ask how I was feeling or if the things he said hurt me. Instead, she begged me to apologize to him just to keep the peace in the house. She looked so tired and fragile, like she was barely holding herself together, and she wanted me to be the one to fix the cracks Garrick was making. I realized then that she was too afraid to stand up for me. During the shouting match that followed downstairs, Garrick let the truth slip out like it was nothing. He admitted he had been taking almost my entire housing allowance for nearly a year. "The military pays family support, and I'm the head of this family," he sneered, crossing his arms over his chest. I stood there, stunned, realizing he genuinely believed that my paycheck belonged to him. He didn't see me as a soldier or an adult. He saw me as a source of income. As soon as he left the house to go cool off at a bar, I sat down and forced myself to look at my banking history on my laptop. My eyes blurred as I scrolled through the months of transfers I hadn't fully tracked. There was thousands of dollars more missing than I had ever remembered authorizing. My heart sank as the math added up to a betrayal I couldn't ignore anymore. Every late-night shift and every grueling drill weekend had been funded into his pockets while I struggled to save a dime. The betrayal was deep, but the realization that my own mother was watching it happen without a word made it feel like my heart was breaking into a million pieces. Later that evening, I waited until the house was quiet and I knew Garrick was out drinking. My heart was thumping in my throat as I crept into his home office. The room smelled like stale cigars and old paper. I needed proof of where my money was going. I checked the usual folders, but then I saw his heavy oak desk. One of the drawers was locked tight. I used a small metal tool to jiggle the lock until it finally clicked open. Inside, I found exactly what I was afraid of. There were printed bank statements showing every transfer from my account to his, along with handwritten calculations that showed he was tracking my pay down to the cent. Then I saw a folder labeled House Equity Plan. My stomach dropped as I flipped through the pages. Garrick hadn't been using my money for household expenses or rent like he claimed. He had been using my military allowance to secretly catch up on his own massive personal debts. He was using my hard work to dig himself out of a hole he had created. I felt sick, realizing how much he had lied to my face while playing the role of a supportive father figure. I kept digging through the folder, my hands shaking so hard the papers rattled. At the very bottom, I found a stack of military direct deposit paperwork. I recognized my name and social security number, but when I looked at the signature line, my blood turned to ice. It wasn't my handwriting. Garrick had forged my signature on documents to control where my pay was sent. He had committed a crime to make sure he stayed in control of my life. I was staring at the evidence of his fraud when I heard a sharp sound from the hallway. Footsteps. Heavy, familiar footsteps were coming right toward the office door. I didn't have time to put the papers back or lock the drawer. The door swung open, and the light from the hall hit Garrick's face. He looked at the open drawer and then at the documents in my hand. His eyes turned dark and full of a cold, dangerous rage I had only seen a few times before. I stood my ground, clutching the papers to my chest, but every instinct told me I was in serious trouble. The man who claimed he raised me now looked like a complete stranger who wanted to destroy me. Garrick didn't just yell. He completely lost control. He stepped into the room and slammed the door behind him, cornering me against the desk. He started screaming that every single dollar I earned existed because he had given me a home after my biological father had disappeared years ago. "You owe me for your entire childhood, Zarel," he shrieked, his face turning a deep, angry red. He claimed that I was a debt he was finally collecting. I looked toward the door and saw my mother, Celine, standing silently in the hallway. She was just watching through the crack in the door, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. I begged her to say something, to tell him he was wrong, to help me. Instead, she looked away and whispered, "Maybe if you just cooperate, Zarel, things will finally calm down." That betrayal hurt more than any of Garrick's screaming. My own mother was choosing his comfort over my safety. The argument ended with Garrick leaning in close, his breath smelling of whiskey, and threatening to report me for financial fraud if I ever try to cut him off. He was turning my own life into a weapon against me, and I felt completely alone. The following weekend, I headed to my reserve duty in Norfolk, Virginia. I tried to act like everything was fine, but I was a nervous wreck. During a mandatory financial wellness meeting, a senior NCO noticed I was staring blankly at my records, my eyes red and tired. He pulled me aside after the meeting and asked if something was wrong. I didn't want to say anything at first, because I felt so much shame and embarrassment. But as he kept talking about the importance of financial readiness, I finally broke down. I reluctantly explained the situation with my allowance and how my stepfather was controlling my money. I expected him to tell me it was a family matter I had to handle on my own. Instead, the counselor's expression went completely still. He didn't look annoyed. He looked serious in a way that scared me. He asked one very specific question: "Who exactly has access to your military pay and your accounts private?" Voss. When I explained that Garrick controlled almost everything and had even forged papers, the counselor immediately ordered me not to touch my accounts or talk to Garrick about this. He quietly mentioned the JAG office, and I realized this was way bigger than family drama. A few days later, I found myself sitting in a sterile, quiet legal office at the base. Captain Mireya Quill sat across from me, reviewing the documents I had managed to sneak out of the house. She was professional and calm, but the moment she saw the forged authorization forms, her expression hardened into stone. She didn't see a family argument. she saw a series of federal
crimes.
She explained to me that tampering with military compensation documents and forging signatures on government forms could trigger serious federal consequences. Hearing Garrick's behavior described in cold, legal terms instead of emotional ones made me feel physically sick. It made everything feel so final and real. Before I stood up to leave, Captain Quill leaned forward and looked me directly in the eyes. She asked if Garrick had ever pressured me, emotionally or physically, to make me surrender my money. I wanted to say no, to protect the idea of my family, but I hesitated for a long time. I thought about the cornering in the office and the constant threats. My silence was my answer. As I walked out, I realized that I couldn't go back to how things were. The bridge was already burning. When I got home that night, I found a piece of paper taped to my bedroom door. It was a fake eviction notice Garrick had typed up. It demanded that I leave the house within 72 hours unless I signed new rent agreements that would give him even more control of my paycheck.
He
didn't even wait for me to put my bag down before he started mocking my service.
He laughed
And told me that reservists were just weekend soldiers pretending to matter, and that I didn't deserve the benefits I was getting. During dinner, he went even further, humiliating me in front of some relatives who had stopped by. He told them I was financially unstable and that he was the only thing keeping me off the streets. I sat there, picking at my food, feeling the weight of their judgment. But then, my cousin slipped a small, folded note under the table and tapped my knee. I opened it later in the bathroom. The note warned me that Garrick had recently tried to borrow money from a local lender using my name as a cosigner. My hands started shaking as I realized he wasn't just stealing my current money, he was trying to ruin my future credit. I spent the next morning at a public library, pulling my full credit report. My heart stopped when I
saw a recent hard inquiry.
Garrick had actually attempted to open a home improvement loan, using my military income as proof of household support. To make it worse, he had listed himself as my authorized financial overseer. I drove home in a daze and confronted my mother, privately in the kitchen. I expected her to be outraged that he was using my identity, but instead, she looked down at her coffee. She admitted that Garrick had convinced her this was just temporary, until they recovered from their debts. I realized then that my mother hadn't just been a witness. She had been helping him hide things from me for much longer than I ever knew.
The
betrayal felt like a heavy weight in my chest. That night, my phone rang. It was the JAG office. Captain Quill told me they were moving forward with an investigation, and she gave me a strict warning. Do not warn Garrick about anything. I had to live in that house with a predator, pretending I didn't know the traps were being set for him. A few days later, I was outside checking the mail when our elderly neighbor, Odessa Wynn, approached me. She had lived next door since before I was born, and she always kept to herself. She leaned over the fence and quietly told me that Garrick had done this kind of thing before. My jaw dropped as she explained that years ago, Garrick had allegedly drained his late brother's disability payments while claiming he was just managing the family finances for the widow. Odessa warned me that Garrick only becomes truly dangerous when he feels people are trying to leave his control or stop his cash flow. She told me she had kept copies of old complaints and letters from back then because nobody listened to a neighbor back then.
She
went inside and brought back a small envelope of papers that proved Garrick had a pattern of financial abuse that stretched back decades. I realized I wasn't just fighting a greedy stepfather. I was fighting a professional manipulator who had been practicing on his own family for years. The history of his abuse made me realize that my mother was likely just another one of his long-term victims. The tension peaked at a large family barbecue that weekend. Garrick stood by the grill, holding a beer and acting like the king of the neighborhood. In front of all our relatives, he started a theatrical speech about how I was abandoning the family after everything he had sacrificed to raise me. He claimed I was refusing to contribute a single cent to the household despite living there for free. I saw several aunts and uncles nodding along, looking at me with disappointment. I nearly cracked under the pressure and yelled the truth, but I remembered Captain Quill's orders. Then Garrick made a huge mistake. He smugly mentioned exact military payment. Figures for my most recent drill weekend. Numbers that nobody should have known unless they were an authorized user on my government account. Across the yard, one of my friends from the reserve unit, who had come along for the food, heard the numbers.
He looked at me.
With a sharp, knowing expression, he immediately recognized the legal problem. A civilian had access to protected military pay data. The look on his face told me that Garrick had just handed us the rope he'd eventually hang with. On Monday morning, I tried to buy gas and my card was declined. When I called the bank, they told me my account was suddenly frozen due to suspicious transfer activity. Garrick acted like he was worried, pretending to comfort me while secretly whispering that it was probably my messy military paperwork causing the trouble. He told me I should just let him handle the bank
Calls.
But later that afternoon, I got a secure message from Captain Maria Quill. She revealed that military investigators had intentionally flagged the account to track the transaction patterns. Garrick had no idea he was being watched. He had unknowingly walked directly into a federal investigation. Captain Quill sent me a file containing surveillance screenshots from various bank branches. They showed Garrick withdrawing cash from multiple ATMs using my credentials and even going inside to make transfers while I was at work. Seeing his face on those black and white security screens made it all feel so much more serious. He wasn't just my mean stepfather anymore. He was a suspect in a federal case, and the walls were finally starting to close in on him. While the legal case was building, I decided to do some investigating of my own into our family history. I went down to the county records office and spent hours looking through property
Deeds.
I discovered something that left me breathless. My late grandmother had partially transferred ownership rights of our family house into a trust for me years ago. Garrick had never
Told me.
He had been demanding rent from me for a house that I actually partially owned. The allowance money he had stolen wasn't just going to his debts, it was paying a mortgage on a property that was supposed to be my inheritance. He wasn't just trying to control my paycheck. He was trying to secure total ownership of the house before I ever learned the truth about the
Trust.
He was literally stealing my own home from under me while making me feel like I was a burden for living there. Every lie he told me about being trailer trash was designed to keep me from realizing I actually had the power. I felt a new kind of fire in my gut, not just anger, but a cold determination to take back what was mine. A few days later, the woman who had filmed the original bank incident reached out to me through social media. She told me that Garrick had actually visited the bank a few days after the fight, loudly demanding that the bank manager find her and make her delete the footage. Her suspicion of his behavior was the only reason she had saved everything and backed it up.
She
sent me the full unedited video, and the audio was much clearer than the version online.
It
captured Garrick admitting to the teller that he controlled my military deposits because she's too emotional and unstable to manage her own money. It was a clear admission of financial coercion. I immediately sent the file to Captain Quill. She told me this was exactly the kind of evidence they needed to prove intent. Garrick still believed this was just a messy family disagreement that he could win by bullying me. He had absolutely no idea that legal authorities were already building a massive file against him. He was still walking around the house like he owned the world, while I was counting down the days until the hammer dropped. Everything changed when I received my orders. I was being sent on an unexpected overseas deployment for a humanitarian logistics assignment. When I told the family, I expected my mother to be proud, but Garrick went into a full panic. He realized that a deployment meant my finances would be permanently separated from his reach, and I'd be out of his physical control. For months, he immediately started pressuring my mother to manipulate me, claiming I was abandoning the family again just when they needed me most. That night, I was sitting in my room when I heard their voices coming through the kitchen vent. I leaned in close and heard something that made my skin crawl. Garrick was discussing ways to gain power of attorney over my affairs so he could access my increased deployment income while I was overseas.
He was
planning to rob me while I was serving my country in a different time zone. Hearing him plot to steal from me while I was in a vulnerable position made me realize he had no bottom. There was no limit to what he would do for money. Remembering what Odessa had said about the old family history, I waited until Garrick and my mother were out at a doctor's appointment. I climbed up into the garage attic, moving through thick cobwebs and old boxes. Tucked away in a corner, I found an old cedar safe that had belonged to my grandmother. I had to use a heavy hammer to break the rusted latch, but inside, I found a treasured chest of secrets. There were handwritten journals documenting years of Garrick's financial manipulation of the family. My grandmother had written detailed notes about his gambling debts, his patterns of intimidation, and how he had hidden property documents. From my mother, one entry from just before she died felt like a message from the grave.
it.
Specifically said, "If anything happens to me, do not let Garrick control Zarel's money.
He will
Eat her alive." I sat on the dusty floor and broke down crying, finally feeling seen by someone who was long gone. Just then, I heard a car pull into the driveway. Garrick was home early.
I
Scrambled to hide the safe and the journals, my heart racing as I realized I was holding the final piece of the puzzle. Garrick could feel the control slipping away, so he decided to attack my reputation.
He launched
A smear campaign on local community pages, accusing me of falsifying military hardship claims, just to get attention and extra money. Some people in town started questioning my integrity, and I felt that familiar wave of public humiliation. It felt just like the day at the bank all over again.
I
Called Captain Quill, my voice shaking with frustration, but she remained completely calm.
She
Told me something I'll never forget. Desperate people always expose themselves when they lose control. Zarel, let him talk. Then she revealed something huge. Because of the evidence I had provided from the safe and the bank records, federal investigators now suspected Garrick of multiple financial crimes that went far beyond my specific case. They were looking into his past management of other people's money and his forged documents. His attempt to smear me was actually drawing more attention to his own shady life. He thought he was winning the public's opinion, but he was actually just handing the investigators a bigger spotlight to shine on his own crimes. I needed to know the full truth about my past, so I finally tracked down my estranged biological father, Ronan Vey. I had grown up believing he had just abandoned us because he didn't care. When we finally met in a quiet diner 2 towns over, he didn't offer me excuses. Instead, he showed me old letters and court documents. He proved that Garrick had systematically isolated my mother from everyone who challenged him, including Ronan. My father had even tried to warn my mother about Garrick's massive gambling problems years ago before Garrick used his local influence to cut off Ronan's custody access. I sat there, staring at the old letters, realizing that my entire childhood memory had been a lie manufactured by my stepfather. He had made me hate my real father so that I would feel like he was my only savior. Ronan looked at me with tears in his eyes and told me he had never stopped trying to find a way back to me. I realized then that Garrick hadn't just stolen my money, he had stolen my relationship with my father for over a decade. The final breaking point happened at a military recognition ceremony held at a local community center. I was standing with my unit, feeling proud of our upcoming mission. Suddenly, Garrick
appeared.
He was clearly drunk and started causing a scene, loudly claiming that all my military achievements existed because of him and his support. Guests and officers stared in shock as he accused me of being a traitor who was destroying the family over a few dollars.
When I
tried to walk away, he lost it and grabbed my arm aggressively, trying to pull me back toward him. Military police moved in instantly, pinning his arms behind his back. Garrick started, screaming at the top of his lungs that he was my legal guardian and financial provider, and that they had no right to touch him. I saw several high-ranking officers exchanging deeply concerned looks as they watched his breakdown. They saw exactly what he was, a bully who couldn't handle a woman he couldn't control. As they led him away in handcuffs, the silence in the room was heavier than any shout. The mask was officially gone. With Garrick in custody, investigators were finally able to dig into his deep secrets. They uncovered massive unpaid gambling debts linked to him under multiple different aliases. Even worse, they found evidence that he had been in the middle of a plan to refinance our family house using my projected military deployment income as his primary proof of household support. He was literally planning to gamble with the roof over my mother's head. When the investigators showed the proof to my mother, Celine, she finally began to understand how deeply she had been manipulated for 20 years. She realized he had been using her as a shield while he robbed her daughter. When she finally confronted him in the holding cell, he didn't apologize. He suffered a violent emotional breakdown and screamed at her, blaming me for turning the government against him. He truly believed he was the victim of a conspiracy, instead of the consequences of his own actions. My mother finally walked away from him that day, her eyes clear for the first time in my life. An emergency legal hearing was scheduled quickly as the JAG office coordinated with civilian prosecutors. Garrick walked into the courtroom looking confident, wearing a cheap suit and a fake smile. He tried to frame everything as a simple misunderstanding about household financial support and rent. But Captain Mireya Quill stood up and introduced the strict military pay regulations. She proved that dependents and family members cannot seize or control service compensation through coercion or forgery. Then, the prosecutors dropped the hammer. They revealed the forged signatures on the direct deposit forms and the evidence of the identity theft. I watched Garrick's attorney turn a pale shade of gray. He looked at his client and then back at the evidence, clearly realizing he was defending a lost cause. Garrick's smug expression started to melt away as he realized that family business didn't count as an excuse for federal fraud. The judge sat there, listening intently, his face showing a growing sense of disgust with every new document that was presented to the court. The most powerful moment came when the bank surveillance footage was played on the big screen in court. The room went dead silent as we watched Garrick looming over me in the lobby, his voice booming as he demanded control of my money. We heard him say, "That money belongs to this house before it belongs to her." The judge visibly winced at the coldness in his voice. Then, the investigators revealed that Garrick had withdrawn my funds within minutes of every reserve pay deposit for nearly 11 months straight. He was hovering over my account, like a vulture. I looked over and saw my mother crying quietly in the gallery, her head in her hands. Captain Quill stood up one last time. Her calm, professional voice changed the entire atmosphere of the room. She explained that military allowances exist to support service members so they can serve, not to fund the greed or abuse of civilians. She revealed that Garrick had even illegally impersonated a financial contact in military systems. By the time she sat down, the courtroom felt like a different place. The predator was finally the one being hunted. During cross-examination, Garrick tried to break me one last time. He glared at me and called me unstable and ungrateful, trying to use the same old words that used to make me cry. But I didn't explode or yell. I just looked at him and said, "You taught me how to survive, Garrick. But the military taught me that I deserved much better than just survival." The entire courtroom went still. For the first time, Garrick looked genuinely shaken. He realized he had no more power over my emotions. The judge ruled overwhelmingly in my favor. Garrick was ordered to repay every cent of the stolen allowance, lost all access to the property trust, and faced a serious criminal investigation for fraud and coercive abuse. The judge directly acknowledged my service and condemned the exploitation of military personnel. Months later, I returned home from my deployment to a quiet house. I renovated the property and restored my grandmother's garden.
I
Even started a program to help other female service members escaping family abuse.
1.
Evening, as I sat on the porch in the peaceful silence, I realized the house finally felt like it was truly mine.